In the quiet, unassuming town of Granite Hollow, nestled in the hills of the American Midwest, a darkness began to stir. On the surface, it was like any other small village, tight-knit, with weathered porches and gravel roads that snaked around the outskirts. But beneath the calm veneer, something was wrong. It started innocuously enough. People went missing. At first, no one thought much of it. The occasional wanderer lost in the woods or the trucker who pulled off the highway to stretch his legs, disappearances like that weren't unheard of in places like this. But as the days passed, the numbers grew. 13 souls, one after another, vanished without a trace. No blood, no struggle, just empty houses and frightened whispers. Detective Elric Graves had seen it all before. But even he couldn't shake the chill crawling up his spine when he got the call. His reputation was built on solving the impossible, diving into cases where logic faltered and the supernatural loomed large. Wendigos, skinwalkers, creatures that lurked at the edges of human comprehension, he was their countermeasure. Arriving in Granite Hollow, Elric's sharp eyes scanned the town. The air was thick with tension, suffocating and oppressive. The locals were tight-lipped, avoiding his gaze like they were afraid to meet it. But there were signs, subtle shifts in the world around him, that something terrible had gripped this place. Elric's first stop was the town's old diner. There, behind the counter, sat Martha, a woman who had lived in Granite Hollow her entire life. Her hands trembled as she poured coffee into his mug, her gaze flicking to the door every few seconds, like she was expecting someone to walk in. "You're the one they called, huh?" she asked, her voice hoarse, as though speaking at all took effort. "I'm here now," Elric replied, leaning in, his gaze locking with hers. "What's going on, Martha?" She hesitated before speaking, her eyes darting around the room. "It's them," she whispered, barely audible. "The children." "The children?" Elric's brow furrowed. "The ones missing?" "No." She shook her head. "The black-eyed ones." The hairs on the back of Elric's neck stood up. He had heard whispers of such things before, children with pitch-black eyes, said to be harbingers of death, creatures born from nightmares. It was a myth, a story told to scare kids, but one that lingered in the darker corners of folklore. "And what about them?" Elric pressed. "Where are they now?" Martha shuddered, her lips trembling. "They're out there, watching. And every time they come, someone else disappears." The town of Granite Hollow sat under an overcast sky, its houses huddled together like nervous children. Detective Elric Graves, his coat whipping in the wind, walked toward the sheriff's office, a squat brick building that looked as tired as the man waiting for him at the door. Sheriff Jack Harlow wasn't a man prone to panic. The lines on his face told stories of long nights and longer regrets, but as Elric approached, he saw something else, fear. The kind of fear that sits deep in the bones and never quite leaves. "Detective Graves," Jack said, extending a calloused hand. "They told me you deal with strange cases." "I've been called worse," Elric replied, shaking the sheriff's hand. "What can you tell me about the disappearances?" Jack sighed and gestured toward his office. Inside, the sheriff's desk was cluttered with papers, coffee stains, and a lamp that cast weak light on an overflowing evidence board. Elric's eyes moved across the faces pinned to the wall, 13 people, all locals, men, women, even 2 children. Beside their pictures were blurry Polaroids of their empty homes, closets left open, meals half-eaten. "No blood," Jack muttered as if reading Elric's mind. "No signs of forced entry, no screams reported. Just, gone. It's like they walked off willingly." "And the children?" Elric asked, his voice low. "The ones Martha mentioned." The sheriff's face paled. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he pulled open a file drawer and slapped a photograph onto the desk. Elric picked it up. The image was grainy, taken from a distance, but clear enough to show 2 figures standing by the edge of the woods. They were children, no older than 9 or 10. Both wore faded clothes, simple, timeless garments that didn't seem quite modern. And their faces. Elric felt his stomach turn. Their eyes were black. Not just dark, but bottomless, like twin voids that swallowed light. Looking at them made his skin crawl. First reported sighting was 2 weeks ago, Jack said, his voice shaking. Old Man Miller saw them outside his farm. He said they were knocking on his door, asking to come inside. What happened to Miller? Jack swallowed. We found him 3 days later in his barn. Dead. Not a mark on him, just, sitting there, staring at the wall like he'd seen something he couldn't understand. Elric put the photograph down and turned toward the window. The wind howled outside, rattling the glass. And you think these kids are connected to the disappearances? I don't think, Graves. I know. Folks have started locking their doors at sunset. You hear stories about them now, people seeing children at their windows, asking to be let in. Always the same thing. Please. We're lost. Let us in. Jack's voice dropped to a whisper. But no one who lets them in is ever seen again. Elric exhaled slowly, his mind racing. He'd heard tales of the black-eyed children before, urban legends born on the fringes of society. Creatures that wore the faces of innocence but carried something far darker within. Some said they were vampires, others demons, or even the spirits of lost souls seeking revenge. But here, in Granite Hollow, they weren't just stories. They were real. By the time Elric stepped outside again, the sun was sinking low on the horizon, spilling red light across the hills like an open wound. The wind had picked up, carrying whispers of something unseen. He stood on the cracked sidewalk, hands in his coat pockets, watching the town. A woman across the street rushed her child inside, slamming the door shut behind them. Curtains fluttered in windows as nervous faces peeked out. The town was closing itself off, as if preparing for an unseen siege. They know something, Elric thought. They're hiding something. As night fell, Elric decided to pay a visit to the Miller farm, the last known place the black-eyed children had been seen. Sheriff Jack lent him an old pickup truck, its headlights cutting through the dark as he drove toward the outskirts of town. The road twisted through endless fields and the occasional dead tree, skeletal against the twilight. When he reached the farm, the place was deserted. The house sat like a tomb, its windows dark and uninviting. The barn loomed nearby, its doors creaking softly in the wind. Elric grabbed a flashlight from the glove compartment and stepped out of the truck. The air here felt wrong, heavy, electric. It pressed down on him like a physical weight. He approached the farmhouse cautiously, boots crunching on dead grass. As he reached the porch, he noticed the door was ajar, hanging crooked on its hinges. He pushed it open. The inside was exactly as the sheriff had described, dishes still on the table, Miller's jacket draped over a chair. It looked lived in, frozen in time. But there was something else, a faint smell in the air, sweet and cloying, like rotting fruit. Elric moved deeper into the house, his flashlight cutting across the shadows. In the living room, he froze. Small footprints, muddy and damp, led from the door to the center of the room, where they stopped abruptly. He knelt down, tracing one of the prints with his gloved hand. The size of a child's foot. But the pattern was wrong. The toes were too sharp, too elongated. Suddenly, he heard it. A soft knock. It came from the front door, so faint he almost missed it. Knock. Knock. Elric stood slowly, hand reaching for the revolver at his side. The knock came again, louder this time. Knock. Knock. Who's there? He called out, his voice steady. No answer. Knock. Knock. Elric moved cautiously toward the door. Through the small window in the wood, he could just make out 2 figures standing on the porch. He hesitated, a cold dread pooling in his gut. Please, a child's voice called from outside. We're lost. We need to come in. Elric didn't respond. He tightened his grip on the flashlight and revolver, his heartbeat thundering in his ears. Please, the voice repeated, softer this time. Let us in. Don't open it, he thought. Every instinct screamed at him to stay away, to turn back. But as he watched, the doorknob began to turn, the old brass handle creaking under unseen pressure. Elric backed away, raising his weapon. I said, who's there? The voice replied, and this time, it came from inside the house. Let us in, Elric. Elric spun around, flashlight cutting through the darkness. The voice echoed through the walls, faint but unmistakable. It was the same child's voice, hollow and cold. He swept the room with his light, but there was no one there. The knocking had stopped. Outside, the wind howled louder, slamming a loose shutter against the house. Elric steadied his breathing, every muscle in his body coiled tight. Show yourself, he said into the dark. From the far corner of the room, a faint giggle answered him, a child's laugh, distorted and wrong. Elric turned sharply, his flashlight landing on the corner, but there was nothing. Just empty space. He backed toward the door, revolver raised. He had dealt with spirits, revenants, and creatures born from nightmares, but this was something else. Something ancient. Something cunning. Suddenly, the giggling stopped, and in its place, a single whisper filled the room. We see you, Elric. Elric stood frozen, his heart pounding like a war drum. We see you, Elric. The voice lingered in the air, soft yet heavy, like a layer of frost that refused to melt. The flashlight trembled slightly in his hand as the beam swept across the empty room. Dust particles glimmered in the stale air, but nothing else stirred. The whisper had come from behind him, from inside the house where no one should have been. Think, Graves, he told himself. He'd faced worse before, vengeful spirits, beasts twisted by ancient hunger, but this felt different. It felt personal. Slowly, he backed toward the front door. His eyes darted to the muddy footprints in the center of the room. They were still there, leading to nowhere, as though the children had simply vanished into the air. Elric reached for the doorknob, preparing to leave, when he felt it, a presence, cold and clammy, pressing against the back of his neck. The feeling of being watched. He turned sharply, gun and flashlight aimed at the corner where the giggle had come from. The beam of light quivered as he steadied his breathing, but nothing moved. The silence grew suffocating, broken only by the faint creaking of the house as it settled. And then, knock, knock, came again, soft and deliberate. This time, it wasn't at the front door. It was coming from the back of the house. Elric cursed under his breath. He knew better than to follow, yet his legs carried him forward anyway, pulled by some unseen force. The farmhouse stretched before him like a labyrinth, its shadows deeper than they should have been. Each creak of the wooden floorboards felt like a warning. The knocking grew louder as he approached the kitchen. Knock, knock. Elric stopped short. Through the back door's small window, he saw them. Two children stood on the porch, their outlines silhouetted against the moonlit fields. They were still, unnaturally so, as though they weren't breathing. Their faces were turned upward, watching him through the glass. Elric's flashlight flickered. His gut twisted. Please, one of the children said softly. The voice was muffled by the door but rang clear in Elric's ears, like a song he couldn't forget. We're cold. We need to come inside. Elric clenched his teeth, his jaw tight. No. He knew better. Stories about the black-eyed children were rare, but the warnings were consistent: never let them inside. He raised his flashlight, aiming the beam directly at the door, and froze. The children were closer. They hadn't moved, not in the human sense of the word, but now they were pressed against the glass, their faces pale and unmoving. The beam revealed every detail: their sunken skin, lips too thin to be real, and those eyes. Twin abysses stared back at him, glossy and endless, blacker than the night itself. For a moment, Elric couldn't breathe. "Let us in," the second child said. Its voice was higher-pitched, more desperate. "We're lost. We don't know where to go." Elric's grip on his revolver tightened. "I know what you are." The children didn't respond. They simply stared, their faces blank masks that hid whatever malice simmered beneath. The windowpane began to rattle, the glass vibrating as though under pressure. "Let us in," the first child said again, and this time, its voice was deeper, older, like something far larger was speaking through it. Elric stepped back, murmuring an incantation under his breath, an old rite he'd learned from a Romanian priest. The rattling stopped. The glass fell silent. And as he raised his flashlight again, the children were gone. Elric didn't sleep that night. He sat in the farmhouse's living room, revolver across his lap, watching the windows. Outside, the wind howled like a living thing, rattling the shutters and carrying faint whispers that drifted in and out of earshot. By dawn, he returned to the truck and drove back into town. Granite Hollow was silent in the early light, its streets deserted. A mist clung to the ground, thick and oppressive, swallowing sound. He parked outside the sheriff's office, where Jack Harlow was already waiting for him, sipping black coffee with trembling hands. "You look like hell," Jack said, studying Elric's face. "I've had worse," Elric replied flatly. "We need to talk about the woods." Jack flinched, his gaze dropping to the steam curling off his coffee. "What about M? Every case I've worked, every story I've heard, points to one thing," Elric said. "The children don't just appear. Something draws them. And whatever it is, it's out there. In the trees." Jack was silent for a long moment before he sighed. "You're not the first to say that. A few of the townsfolk have been, muttering. They think something woke up in those woods." "Woke up?" Elric frowned. "What are you talking about?" Jack hesitated, chewing on his words before answering. "There's a story. An old one. My grandfather told it to me when I was a kid, said it was nothing more than a ghost tale to keep children out of the forest. The Whispering Ones, he called them." Elric raised an eyebrow. "The black-eyed children? Maybe. Maybe not." Jack set his cup down. "The story goes that long ago, something bad happened in those woods. A family, nobody knows their name, lived out there on their own. One winter, they disappeared without a trace. The next spring, people started seeing children with black eyes wandering out of the trees. They begged for shelter, pleaded for food. But anyone who let them in vanished." Elric leaned back, his thoughts racing. "And those who didn't?" Jack's eyes darkened. "They say the children wait. They watch you. And eventually, they take you anyway." A chill ran down Elric's spine. He'd heard similar stories in his years investigating the supernatural. The details changed, but the theme remained, black-eyed apparitions tied to ancient evils, always seeking entry, always waiting for permission. "Have you been out there?" Elric asked. Jack shook his head. "Not in years. And I don't plan on starting now." "I'll go," Elric said. Jack looked at him like he'd lost his mind. "Alone? You're nuts." Elric smirked grimly. "I've been called worse." Later that day, Elric found himself at the edge of Granite Hollow's woods, staring into the abyss of trees that stretched endlessly before him. The forest seemed to breathe, its shadows shifting like restless things. The sun barely pierced the thick canopy, casting everything in a murky half-light. He stepped forward, boots crunching on dead leaves. The further he went, the quieter the world became. The wind died, the birds fell silent, and even his own footsteps seemed muffled. Time stretched, and soon he lost all sense of direction. The deeper he ventured, the heavier the air grew, thick with the smell of earth and rot. Then he heard it. Soft laughter. Like children playing. Elric froze, his hand resting on the grip of his revolver. The sound drifted toward him, carried on a breeze that didn't touch the trees. Slowly, he turned his head. At the edge of his vision, half hidden behind a gnarled oak, a child stood. A little girl in a faded blue dress, barefoot, her hair hanging limp around her face. She was watching him. "Elric," she whispered. Her voice was faint but clear, despite the distance. "How do you know my name?" Elric called, his voice sharp. The girl didn't answer. She tilted her head slowly, her hair parting just enough for Elric to see her eyes. They were black as midnight, endless pits that promised nothing but darkness. "Elric," she whispered again, this time from behind him. Elric spun around, gun raised. The woods were empty. But the laughter continued. The laughter died as suddenly as it had begun, leaving an eerie silence that felt heavier than the earth itself. Elric's breath misted in the cold air, his revolver steady in his hands. He knew better than to let his guard down, this was the moment when hunters became prey. "They're toying with me," he thought, scanning the shadows. The girl had disappeared, her black eyes lingering in his mind like a stain that couldn't be scrubbed away. Elric pressed forward, deeper into the woods. He followed a faint, unnatural path, one that felt wrong with every step. The trees here were twisted, their bark split as if from old wounds. And the deeper he went, the more he noticed them, symbols carved into the trees. Jagged spirals, crooked crosses, and circles that looked almost like faces screaming in agony. He knelt beside one, tracing the gouged lines with his gloved fingers. Wards. Protective sigils, perhaps, but their patterns were incomplete, broken, defiled, maybe. Someone had been here before him. Someone who knew these woods weren't just dark, they were tainted. Elric rose and kept moving, the faint sound of his boots the only noise breaking the void. Then he saw it. In a clearing ahead, shrouded in mist, stood an old cabin. Its wooden walls sagged inward as though they carried centuries of grief. The roof had partially collapsed, and ivy crawled up its sides like a serpent claiming its prize. But it was alive. Elric could feel it, an invisible pulse radiating from the structure, slow and deliberate, like a heartbeat buried under the earth. "This place," he muttered, gripping the revolver tighter, "it's the anchor." The legends of the black-eyed children were clear in one regard, such entities didn't just appear. They were summoned, pulled into the world by rituals, blood offerings, or tragedies soaked into the land. This cabin was where it began. As he approached, Elric noticed the ground outside the cabin door. It was disturbed, muddy despite the cold. Tiny footprints, children's footprints, led in every direction, as though they danced in a frenzy. Elric's gut twisted. "You shouldn't be here," a voice seemed to say, though it wasn't spoken aloud. Ignoring the warning in his head, Elric reached for the cabin door and pushed it open. The inside of the cabin was worse than Elric could have imagined. It was dark, the walls stained with something black that had congealed long ago. The air was heavy, metallic, carrying a faint stench of rot. The floor creaked as he moved, and Elric's flashlight swept over the room. A table sat in the center, its surface gouged with the same strange symbols he'd seen carved into the trees. Surrounding the table were candles, long since burned out, arranged in an uneven circle. And beyond that, Elric's flashlight flickered over the far wall, and his stomach turned. Childlike handprints, dozens of them, smudged the wooden planks, the dark stains glistening faintly. Some were fresh. Blood. Elric swallowed the bile rising in his throat. He'd witnessed ritual sacrifice before, cults who'd strayed too far into forbidden things, but this was different. The handprints weren't desperate, they were deliberate, almost playful, as though the children had willingly left them. "This isn't just a summoning," he said aloud, trying to keep his thoughts steady. It's an invitation. He crouched beside the table, inspecting the symbols more closely. The patterns weren't random, they formed a gateway, an ancient conduit to bring something across the threshold. Something hungry. And whoever had done this hadn't just invited the black-eyed children, they'd anchored them here. The sound of footsteps, small, soft, echoed behind him. Elric spun around, revolver raised. The flashlight beam danced across the room, and for a split second, he saw them. 3 children stood in the doorway, silhouetted against the faint light filtering through the trees. They were still, their faces pale and lifeless. And their eyes. Those eyes. "Let us in," one of them said. A little boy this time. His voice was calm, emotionless, as though he were reading lines from a script. "We're so cold, Elric. How do you know my name?" Elric demanded, his voice steady despite the dread crawling up his spine. "Let us in," the boy repeated. His lips didn't move. His voice seemed to come from everywhere. Elric backed toward the table, revolver aimed at the children. "You're not human. What are you?" The children tilted their heads in unison, the motion unnaturally synchronized. Then the boy spoke again, his voice dropping to something impossibly deep, guttural. "You already know." The cabin's walls groaned, the wood straining as though something massive was pressing against it from the outside. Elric's flashlight flickered, the beam sputtering in and out. The children stepped closer. Elric whispered a protective incantation, an old rite he'd memorized long ago. The symbols on the table flared faintly in response, a brief pulse of blue light pushing outward. The children stopped, their forms wavering as though made of smoke. "Not yet," Elric muttered, heart pounding. "You're not taking me yet." He reached into his coat, pulling out a pouch of salt and a vial of holy water. Moving quickly, he poured a line of salt across the doorway and splashed the holy water in a wide arc. The cabin groaned louder, the pressure building as if something immense and ancient were watching from beyond the walls. The children let out a sound, a hiss, sharp and unnatural, that made Elric's ears ring. They didn't cross the salt line. They couldn't. "We'll wait, Elric," the boy said softly, his black eyes burning like coals. "You can't stop us. Not forever." Then, as suddenly as they'd appeared, the children were gone. The cabin fell silent. Elric sank onto the edge of the table, wiping cold sweat from his brow. The symbols in the wood had dulled again, their power flickering like a dying flame. Whatever ritual had been started here wasn't finished, there was still a chance to sever the connection. But he would have to go deeper. He pulled out his notebook, scrawling down what he'd learned. 1. The black-eyed children are bound here. 2. This cabin is the anchor. 3. The ritual, whatever it is, needs to be undone. The sound of the wind returned outside, faint whispers carried on its breath. Elric exhaled, rising to his feet. He knew what he had to do. But what he didn't know was how much time he had left. Back in Granite Hollow, the sun had dipped below the hills, and the street lamp struggled to push back the shadows. Elric parked the truck in front of the diner where Martha worked. He needed answers, real ones. Someone in this town had summoned those children, and they were still here. Martha spotted him as soon as he entered, her eyes widening. "Back already?" she asked, her voice trembling. "You look pale, detective." Elric sat at the counter, leveling his gaze at her. "What aren't you telling me, Martha? What does this town know?" Martha looked around nervously, lowering her voice. "Some things are better left buried, Mr. Graves." "Not when they're taking people," Elric shot back. "Tell me about the woods. About the family who disappeared." Martha hesitated, her lips pursed. "They were the Hawthorne family," she said finally. "Lived out there 100 years ago, before the town was settled proper. They were outcasts. Folks said they practiced dark things. What happened to them?" Martha swallowed. One winter, they starved. The family's children went begging for help, but no one let them in. And so they died. All of them. Alone. Hungry. Elric felt a chill seep into his bones. And now they've come back. Martha nodded, her face pale. They don't forgive, detective. And they don't forget. Elric sat in stunned silence, Martha's words hanging in the air like the smell of rot from the cabin. The Hawthorne family, outcasts, abandoned, and left to die, were the root of the darkness that gripped Granite Hollow. Their children, cold and starving, had become something far worse, revenants bound to vengeance, creatures lurking on the edges of reality. They were victims, Elric muttered, but now they're the hunters. Martha nodded solemnly. The town ignored them, and this is our curse. You knew, Elric said sharply, turning to face her fully. You all knew. Martha's lip trembled. We didn't know what to do. Sheriff Harlow tried to keep people calm, but when the disappearances started, it was too late. Elric slammed his fist onto the counter, the diner rattling under the blow. Too late for what? To undo this? To break the anchor holding them here? Martha glanced over her shoulder as if someone, or something, might hear them. There's a way, she whispered. There always was. Elric's eyes narrowed. How? The ritual that binds them, it can be reversed, she said. But it requires someone to face them in the woods, on their ground, where it all began. You'll need to destroy the symbols, close the gateway at that old cabin, and offer something that balances the scales. An offering? Elric echoed, his tone cold. Martha met his gaze, her face pale and lined with fear. Life for life, detective. It's always been that way. Elric exhaled slowly. He'd been prepared for monsters, rituals, and even curses, but a blood offering wasn't something he accepted lightly. Still, there were 13 souls missing. If he didn't act, more would follow. He stood, throwing cash on the counter. Get everyone indoors, Martha. Tell the sheriff to lock down the town. This ends tonight. Elric returned to the sheriff's office to find Jack Harlow pacing like a man walking to his own funeral. Did you find anything? Jack asked, his voice ragged. Enough to finish this, Elric replied, grabbing supplies from his bag, a pouch of salt, his silver revolver, and a flask of holy water mixed with iron shavings. We're going back to that cabin. Jack paled. You're serious? You want me to come with you? No, Elric met his eyes. You need to keep the town safe. Whatever happens out there, don't let anyone step outside tonight. Jack hesitated, but eventually nodded. God help you, Graves. Elric didn't respond. He had his tools, his knowledge, and just enough recklessness to get the job done. Climbing into the truck, he drove back toward the woods, headlights cutting through the growing dark. The forest was waiting for him, shadows deeper now, as if the trees themselves knew what was coming. Elric carried his supplies to the cabin, his breath misting in the frigid air. This time, he didn't hesitate. Inside, the darkness was alive. The walls groaned as though they could feel him there, and whispers skittered through the air. He approached the table, its symbols faintly glowing, and began his work. Destroy the symbols, close the gateway, he muttered. One step at a time. He poured a ring of salt around the table, chanting a rite of severance he'd learned in Prague years ago. The symbols began to flicker violently, as though something was resisting his work. Then the voices began. Elric. He froze, turning sharply. The children were in the doorway again. Their black eyes burned like coals, and their faces were masks of cold indifference. Stop, the little boy said, his voice deep and hollow. You don't belong here. Elric ignored them, slamming the butt of his revolver onto the center of the table. The symbols cracked, and the cabin shook violently, as if the earth itself protested his actions. Leave, the children screamed in unison. But Elric didn't stop. He lit a vial of oil mixed with salt and holy water, throwing it onto the table. Flames erupted, blue and wild, licking upward and consuming the sigils. The children wailed, a sound so piercing it felt like needles driven into his skull. Elric stumbled backward as the fire roared, the symbols burning away. "You're not getting out this time," he growled through gritted teeth. The cabin trembled. The air split open with a sound like 1,000 whispers all speaking at once. And then they came. The children emerged from the dark, dozens of them, filling the cabin. Their small forms surrounded Elric, their eyes black as night, their voices a chorus of torment. "You can't save them, Elric," the boy said, stepping forward. His face was pale and hollow, skin stretched too tight over sharp bones. "You're alone." Elric leveled his revolver at the boy, his hand steady. "You think I'm afraid of you? I've faced worse things than shadows in the dark." The boy smiled, a sharp, unnatural thing, and the children stepped closer. "You can't break the curse without the offering. Life for life." Elric's pulse quickened, sweat trickling down his brow. He could feel the truth in the boy's words. The ritual would never close completely without a price. But he wasn't ready to die. "No," Elric said, his voice a growl. "Not mine." He reached into his coat, pulling out a locket, a small, tarnished thing he'd found earlier in the cabin, engraved with the name Hawthorne. The children froze, their movements halting as though they were puppets whose strings had been severed. "This is yours," Elric said, holding it up to the boy. "This is your anchor. Your blood called you here, and your blood will set you free." The boy's smile faltered, his black eyes flickering. "No." Elric didn't wait. He hurled the locket into the flames, shouting an incantation that burned his throat as it left his lips. The blue fire erupted, engulfing the cabin in light. The children screamed. Their bodies wavered, splitting apart like mist under sunlight. Elric shielded his eyes, the sound deafening, as the curse began to unravel. When Elric opened his eyes, the cabin was silent. The fire had burned itself out, leaving nothing but ash and smoldering wood. The symbols were gone, the sigils broken. He stumbled outside, gasping for air. The forest was still, calm, even. For the first time since arriving in Granite Hollow, the air didn't feel oppressive. The weight that had hung over the woods had lifted. And the children were gone. Elric collapsed against the truck, feeling the exhaustion in every bone. The wind blew softly through the trees, carrying the faint scent of ash and earth. He knew it wasn't a perfect ending. The Hawthorne family had been wronged, abandoned by those who should have protected them. But their curse had been broken. The town was safe. For now. A week later, Granite Hollow was still recovering. 13 missing people didn't come back, and their absence weighed heavily on the town. But the disappearances had stopped. The children were no longer seen lurking on doorsteps or whispering from the dark. Sheriff Jack Harlow met Elric on the edge of town as he prepared to leave. "You did it," Jack said, shaking Elric's hand. "I don't know how, but you did." "I don't need thanks," Elric replied, climbing into his truck. "Just make sure this never happens again." Jack frowned. "What do you mean?" Elric looked out toward the woods, where the trees stood silent and still. "Curses like this don't vanish. They wait. Someone let them in once. Don't let it happen again." Jack nodded solemnly. As Elric drove out of Granite Hollow, he caught a glimpse of something in the rearview mirror, a figure, small and still, standing at the edge of the woods. It was a child, its face pale, its eyes black as coal. Elric's grip tightened on the wheel, his heart pounding. But when he looked again, the figure was gone. For now. The children might have been banished, but the darkness always finds a way back. And Elric Graves would be there, waiting for it.